this to me is like the really fascinating material.
We don't know what the answer is, but we're looking for patterns.
I think we're looking at kind of a type of cosmic alchemy.
The story slowly grew into the mythos.
But still, a lot of people don't know that this technology actually exists.
The possibilities here are pretty mind-boggling.
We can't just believe that it was the work of these lone troubled individuals.
Like a conspiracy theorist would look at that and say, well, the Illuminati or somebody planned this way in advance.
Or is that by design?
Looking for meaningful coincidences.
The same pattern.
You're interfacing with your neural circuitry, they're mapping your electromagnetic field to interface it onto an artificial intelligence array system.
All right, back on Conspirinormal. We're back at Studio B.
Studio B is a place to be.
Hopefully Rob isn't in a coffin by the end of the night. Hope he's okay. You guys don't get to talk to Rob tonight. He's not been feeling well, man. So just send some good thoughts his way.
Thoughts and prayers.
But yeah, thoughts and prayers. We can send your thoughts and your prayers. So we are here, and we've got kind of an interesting show tonight. I don't really know what to expect on this one because I'm pretty much letting Serfiel taking the reins on this one tonight.
The lunatics have taken over the asylum.
Yeah. Well, we've got Wren Collier back.
Hey, everyone.
And I know Wren was just here like 2 shows ago. So you might have reached your quota for the year on Conspirinormal, Wren. I'm not sure.
Everyone already thinks we're a bunch of communists, man. We just
Yeah.
Well, sure.
They're really going to think we're communists after tonight. And his friend Matt Ashley, who's never done a podcast before. Matt, welcome to Conspirinormal, man.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Yeah, how do you know Wren?
I know Wren from the OTO Lodge.
Okay. That's like a whole other podcast in and of itself right there.
It definitely is.
Like Wren's life is like 6 or 7 different podcasts, I think. But
He seems to be something of a polymath.
He is. And we're gonna talk about like you've got kind of like experts, kind of like was like Russian or Soviet Psi expert, Psi Research.
Yeah, all the nice black experiments they were doing during the Cold War.
Yeah,
awesome.
Yeah,
awesome.
we're gonna get to that, but first, Wren, you went down to Frankfort, Kentucky. You drove yourself down like 15 hours or something, pretty close to us, and you went to Cryptidcon this weekend.
Yep, and Frankfurt. Yeah, it was a really nice conference. Originally, I'd agreed to go because some of the guys from the Cruise Them with Steak podcast and Grammarica were going to be there. We all kind of wanted to meet up and have a good time. I was kind of treating it as like, oh, well, this will be fun. I'm not a super into cryptids guy. Like, I love Bigfoot stuff and cryptid stuff in general, but I'm not like a serious cryptid researcher or anything. So I wasn't expecting a whole lot from the conference, but it was actually way more esoteric and eclectic than I thought it would be. I went down there expecting turds and tracks type stuff. And it ended up being like there was a panel that I went to about manifestations of the fairy realm that Josh Cutchin would have loved. There was a great like David Pilates talk. Travis Walton was there, so I got to meet him and listen to a panel where he kind of went over his experiences and stuff. So there was quite a wide variety of panels and talks there. I went to one about the history of the Ouija board. So it was kind of all over the place. It was way more enjoyable than I originally thought, and we had a great time.
Oh yeah, man. We were thinking about going, but I had some like things like life got in the way for me, so we didn't get to go. But maybe next year. I know we're definitely gonna try for Paramania down in Atlanta. So
yeah, Paramania will be a lot of.
Do you have the Bigfoot scatological update for us?
I will say that David Pilates has solved the entire Bigfoot problem.
Oh, good for him. It's about time somebody did.
His panel was incredible.
Tell us all about it, man. Because you sent some things to the Word of the Road Go Slack, but I have to know some details on this, because Paulides is very controversial, is the way that I would put it. There's a lot of people that really worship the guy, and then there's a lot of people that just think the guy's just a total asshole.
Well, you can be both. So, like, I love Paulides missing 411 stuff. It's creepy, it's fun, it's scary, it's like a great mystery. He also has kind of an abrasive personality. It's not so much that he's a jerk, but that he's very he's a cop. I mean, he's just very like assertive, and I know what I know, and I deal in facts, and I don't speculate on stuff. So and I'm also like a fan of like master tier trolling of people, especially Bigfoot people. So with him going up on stage and telling all of this room full of Bigfoot researchers that and I'm going to paraphrase here. Did he drop
a turd in a punch bowl? Is that what it was, figuratively?
Kind of did a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm going to paraphrase here. I'm not quoting David, so please don't arrest me, David. But like, he basically told them they were all idiots, that they don't actually do the research. They don't conduct any of the research properly. They suppress evidence that doesn't fit their narrative. It's actually almost kind of like a UFO. It reminded me like of some of the controversies in like UFO research. Mm-hmm. And his basic thing was that he went out to these sort of Native American reservations, and on behalf of some apparently rich benefactors, and did this Bigfoot research. And his takeaway from the whole thing is apparently got a white paper on a site that you can read, which I haven't had a chance to read yet. But his basic thing was they got DNA samples. They were able to collect a lot of hair using these like traps, basically, that were like Scotch tape around a tree that they put like McDonald's morning breakfast waffles in or pancakes in.
What?
Yeah. Genius level stuff. I mean, this is galaxy brain level stuff. And his whole thing is that they're human. Like they're just like they're like
obviously if they
human.
like McDonald's breakfast.
They do. They love McDonald's breakfast. They're basically all human beings. All the hair samples came back human. And that the Native Americans have known about them for a long time and just consider them like a different tribe of Native Americans that are sort of like, I don't know, like wild men or whatever. They kind of live out in the woods and stuff. But he was basically like, they're not apes. Like they have human faces. He had these like forensic, the sketch artist guy who did sketches of all the witnesses who described it to him, and the sketches all look human. And I sort of agree with the guy a little bit on some level. I just I also have a more esoteric view of it too, and that I don't think they're entirely physical creatures. Sure. But
right, same here.
It was still funny to hear him basically like just talking smack on all these Bigfoot researchers. You could just feel the tension in the room. And then a guy had a stroke in the middle of the talk.
What?
Like I was like sitting over close to him. He was standing up against the wall.
He just couldn't take it. He couldn't take the information.
He couldn't take it. It literally blew. It literally blew his brain out.
What
he just like
in the hell?
This guy, he was this old guy. He just like fell down, and I mean, just like stiff. And I saw him looking, and like his eyes were open, but I mean, he wasn't seeing anything. He was out of it. And then he came to, and his family, I guess, got him out of the building. And I mean, I hope he's okay. I guess they took him to the hospital.
Christ,
but
man.
then David just starts up the thing again, like doesn't even miss a beat.
Thinking of Bigfoot as a human being is way scarier to me than like some weird, cryptid that doesn't want to mess with us or something, because we all know what people are capable of. That's way that's freakier.
Yeah. Yeah, and then he went into the missing 411 stuff, I guess, because he has to or whatever. And he was just going over case after case after case, and like I started to fall asleep, and like it got to the end of it, and he went over like I think like almost 20 minutes over his allotted time, like cut into another panel that was supposed to come on. It was just, I mean, just masterful trolling. And for people, you know, Paulides' big thing is that he doesn't speculate, but he was getting awfully close to basically saying the missing 401 stuff was UFOs.
Really?
Yeah, like he brought up one case, and then he brought up the fact that there had been like some abductions in the same area. Like almost as like a non sequitur, but sort of a wink wink kind of thing. And I know he would deny it if you asked him that, but there were a couple of things that he brought up that were very much like, you know, I'm not saying it's aliens, but it's aliens. You know, so that was a fun talk.
Well, you know,
and,
MUFON just had him at their symposium.
I think he's leaning that. I doubt he's ever going to like come out and say something as explicit as that.
Right.
But he's definitely beating around the bush a lot. That he
It's
thinks
like
is.
a limited hangout position.
Yeah.
I don't know, man. I don't know about Paulides anymore. I honestly don't. I mean, yeah, you can sit there and listen to that stuff, and it'll really creep you out. But then when you really start kind of thinking about some of the cases, you're just like, well, wait a minute, that's not as weird as he's making it out to be.
Yeah, there's definitely like some showmanship that goes into it.
Yeah.
And like the whole cluster zones thing, I still don't really buy. I mean, look, he's like, okay, well, you have all these cases around the Great Lakes and around on the East Coast and on the West Coast, and this big band down the middle of the U.S. where you don't have any of these cases. And I'm like, that's because nobody lives there. Like,
right.
That's where all the people are, where you see in your cases. I don't.
One of the things about it is that you have this whole concept that, well, the dogs couldn't find the scent, and the bad weather was setting in. Well, anytime the bad weather sets in, that's what's going to happen. You know, I've made this point before. We had this Waffle House shooter here in Nashville back, when was that, March?
Yeah.
And it rained the whole next day after he did this, and they were out looking for him with the dogs. Well, the dogs couldn't find a scent because it was just heavily rain. So that's not unusual. But the way that he presents it, he makes it sound like, well, this is just weird.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And it says some stuff that shows us cards a little bit too. Like he was talking about one of the cases in which the dogs couldn't find the scent, but it turned out that the it's on the scent of like the dad and not the kid who was missing. So it's like, I don't know. Like you said, I think there's almost like a P.T. Barnum-esque aspect to the way he presents some of this stuff to kind of creep people out and make them think it's more significant than it really is.
Right. And when he talks about the urban disappearances, well, that's something completely different. I mean, dealing with the smiley face killer stuff, I mean, that's completely that's something completely different. I don't think that has anything even to do with the stuff that happens in the wilderness.
It's less supernatural.
Yeah, so he conflates a lot of stuff and puts it together, and it's like, and he's always like, well, I don't know, I don't really know what's going on, and that makes it even more mysterious, you know.
Yeah,
but he's got Bigfoot
smart.
figured out, so thank God for that.
Yeah, he is smart about that. The fact that he doesn't speculate actually makes it more compelling to people.
Yeah.
Because they want him to, and they keep reading his books because they think he's going to be. But
that's a good game. Yeah.
It is a good game, yeah.
I've just heard way too many horror stories about Paulides.
Really?
You know, just a lot of people have been really unhappy with him, and he tries to own this material, and it's just kind of like, well, no, dude, it's, you know, this is publicly, all this stuff is public information.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, and
I remember there was
controversy. He doesn't own stuff that's public information. He may put it together in a certain way, but he doesn't own the information itself.
Exactly. These disappearances are public, and if someone else wants to write a book about it, there's nothing he can really do about it.
Right.
I mean, that's just part of the territory if you're right.
But he gets all butthurt about it.
Yeah.
You know. Anyway, so enough on my soapbox. Was there anything else that stood out to you at Cryptidcon?
Not really. I mean, we just met a lot of cool people. A lot of ghost hunters there. I did a bunch of karaoke while drinking wild turkey. It was a good time.
Awesome. What did you sing?
I sang Long Tall Sally by Little Richard. I did China Girl in the Iggy Pop style.
Oh,
and
nice.
I did
By
some
far
Talking
the
Heads.
superior version.
It is.
Yep. All right. Well, let's get into the main subject, guys, and that's space communism. And I'm going to turn it over to Serfiel.
Okay, this is the Conspirinormal Space Communist Spectacular. So what, I mean, it's kind of a buzzword in a lot of the memosphere and stuff, but what I wanted to talk about is a really interesting history of the imaginings of space and the paranormal in the former Soviet Union. And there's a lot of really disparate ideas, so I wrote a little thing I want to read to kind of tie them all in before we get into the main discussion. So we're going to talk about everything from the history of Russian Cosmism to how these ideas were shaped in the Soviet establishment as well, and then we're going to get into the Soviet Union and the communist world, their view of UFOs, and then Psi Research as well. So we're going to kind of be all over the place. I'm going to go ahead and read this though. So, something always attracted me to the futuristic aspects of socialist realism, science fiction, and architecture of the USSR. From the space race era propaganda posters to stunning examples of brutalist architecture and monuments whose crumbling remains now seem like the ruins of a lost civilization, I could never articulate what the feeling was, but perhaps I could sense that these were pregnant with the longing and cosmic vision that was unique to the civilization and both cultivated and suppressed by the communist regime. Did I sense a uniquely Russian current that predated the Soviet Union but was also empowered and shaped by it? Maybe I also sensed a spiritual mission from the staunchly atheist empire. What became known as Russian Cosmism was a broad grouping of scientists, mystics, writers, artists, and thinkers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries who, with the dawn of a new technological and scientific age and an approaching cosmic consciousness of mankind, theorized what man and their nation's role should be and could be in this new age. With many seeming to have taken an extremist adaptation of many tenets of positivism, they viewed the total triumph over nature and space colonization as an inevitability and just around the corner. Death itself will be conquered, and man will control his own evolution as well as the Earth's as he journeys into the cosmos. Cosmism had a profound impact on Russian intellectual society before the revolution, and along with other futurist-minded groups, the new regime was seen as an opportunity to develop and implement their ideas for the future of society. Already primed by cosmism, the new question became, what is the function of communism on a cosmic scale? To the deterministic Marxists, the overcoming of capitalism was a concrete reality that was destined. This freed their imaginations to focus on the future of humankind working in a collective effort. Though the Soviet government operated in the same nation-state system, idealists could imagine space without nationalism and their unique role being the vanguard for all of humanity. These imaginings would also show their influence in the population of the USSR and communist movements when the UFO and contactee phenomenon became popular in the mid-century. If we are being visited by beings from another world, they must be more advanced and hence fellow communists. This thinking would manifest in Soviet science fiction and be politicized most notably by the Posadist movement, the Trotskyist sect which sought to establish a proletarian contact with our space comrades. Much has been theorized on Russia's unique civilizational space, its late arrival to the Enlightenment and other political and economic developments, as well as it having a more spiritual character than the rest of Europe. All these factors helped shape the development of cosmic thinking and even maintained an openness to psychic phenomenon, which the state openly conducted psi studies as well. All right, so space communism, and we've got an expert on Soviet Psi Research, and we've got Wren, who really introduced us to Posadism.
Yeah, I'd never heard of it before that.
Yeah, Posadism is really interesting.
So, Wren, what do you know about the cosmos, both before the revolution and how the revolution impacted them?
So I wasn't super familiar with Cosmism until you introduced me to it,
Cool.
and I was
Totally
listening
new
to
me
that.
too.
Yeah, I was listening to that talk at the Rosicrucian meeting about sort of the idea behind cosmism, and it's interesting because it like that whole idea behind the noosphere and sort of the idea that like atoms are units of intelligence. Like I never realized those are cosmist ideas,
Right.
or at least those kind of ideas were being discussed by cosmists. And those ideas are kind of coming around full circle now and are quite vogue. This, what's the way to describe it now?
Transhumanism?
Not transhumanism, like sort of the atom as unit of consciousness. I can't find it now, but yeah, like it's kind of a popular thing now. That people are starting to say, okay, well, the universe might be made of information, and individual atoms might have some unit of consciousness, and so like maybe the stars are conscious and that sort of thing. When I was listening and reading about cosmism, I was like, well, these guys were saying this back in the 1930s, that like like all matter is conscious on some level, and it indicates like sort of this move towards, I don't know, like unity amongst man and nature and their environment. I thought that was super interesting.
Yeah, it's crazy as far as like I saw it as, and of course it's been noted by a lot of people that it's like it's really a forecasting of transhumanism, but
I agree with that.
yeah, but to me it's like it's uniquely Russian that because they were late to so much Enlightenment stuff, they kind of took the positivism and just ran with it to this like crazy, logical conclusion. Like, everything was just imminent, right around the corner. We're just gonna, it's all just gonna happen. And, real extremists with ideas of progress. And that was, it's really crazy because it really forecasts all these transhumanist ideas, engineering the planet and controlling human and the Earth's evolution, and this was all pre-Russian Revolution.
Yeah, it's interesting too because like me coming into this from like an occultist perspective. How many of you are familiar with like the Seth stuff, like the Seth channeling?
I'm unfamiliar.
Okay, so the Seth material is basically a collection of writing by Jane Roberts, who is an American writer who started having these channeling sessions with this entity she called Seth.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the things that Seth would say are very similar to some of these ideas that the Russian cosmists were having. Like, again, the idea that, like all people are made up of a number of like consciousness units, that all of the atoms in your body have some level of consciousness that creates sort of a whole for yourself, and that we're not like individually sort of conscious, but rather
it's just a piece of a multi-consciousness kind of framework.
Mm-hmm.
What else is interesting is they kind of, so when you were talking about that cosmic dust or whatever, they view this as their ancestors. So even Fedorov, the guy who kind of started this, Nikolai Fedorov, he would call it ancestral dust. And so he also had something that was called the common task, which was like the goal of all of humanity, which was to basically like reintegrate or disintegrates, and specifically with your dead relatives, your ancestors. So part of this, kind of, it's almost like a reverse engineering of nature, very alchemical and kind of transhumanist at the same time,
He was, I guess he had a Russian Orthodox background too, and he was considered a religious theoretician first. And he sought to he thought the goal of humankind was we were going to do God's work now, and we are going to resurrect, took the Christ image, and we're going to resurrect all past people as well as us and everyone after us, or who we create, living forever.
Yeah, that's how they look at it.
This is like late 19th century.
It's interesting you brought up his religious background, because Eastern Orthodoxy is a huge chunk of the entire Russian story, but specifically when we get to this parapsychology and this kind of out of the box thinking, that is a product of their Eastern Orthodoxy, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree. And then as well as Fedorov, we had Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, and he wrote the first books that theorized space travel. He was a scientist, and he did work on rocketry that even influenced von Braun. This is, even before the Germans were as advanced as them with rocketry, and he developed a philosophy of panpsychism as well that I'm not sure what panpsychism exactly was, but
that's the word I was trying to remember.
Okay, that's the atoms.
Yeah. The idea that basically our constitutive panpsychism is that matter already has experience, and that
right. Okay.
Basically, every subatomic particles possess some very simple form of consciousness, and that our own consciousnesses are constituted by a combination of the subjective inner lives of the countless physical particles that make up our nervous system.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, and he was a scientist who had. I mean, they have statues to him still in Russia, and he was a scientist whose work was a part of the official state system later on. So it's pretty interesting, and how this stuff survived the USSR, and I think that I know Lenin and later Stalin had a lot of problems with a lot of these figures because they thought it was too religious. But I think also a lot of Soviet authorities probably saw a good replacement for religion in a lot of this cosmic thinking, giving this big mission, be it materialist to their country and civilization.
Mm-hmm.
I think to a small degree that they might have even been scared of it a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I read an anecdote about Stalin where I forget the name of the particular psychic. He was basically wanting to test the guy, right? So the test he designed was he had the guy go into some political building, right, where there's multiple checkpoints, right, the front door, each level of each floor, 3-4 guards to get to the floor he's at. So they bring him in escorted. And his task is to get himself out of the building with no passes or clearances, and go to the street where he can see the window and then wave back to whoever was in the building. And he does this, makes it out. And when they ask him how he did it, what he said was that he took the face of his original escort into the building. And then when he was in front of each of the guards, he would project that face to them. So they saw a different face than his, and that allowed him to escape. And this essentially scared Stalin. There's nothing that can be really secure, So I think in a way that this kind of science, scares the powers that be,
Absolutely.
I feel like that's one reason you didn't really see a real kickoff on a research until after Stalin's death.
Right, early 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And so how did this kind of imagining affect their space program too? Because like I was saying, I think they could think of their space program a little more cosmically than us, because we were like just nationalists, we're like, oh, well, I mean, I know it's one small step for man and all that, but essentially it was about what America was doing. I think the cosmic Russian mission, because of their Marxist imaginings, were that they were doing this for all of mankind.
I would agree with you there. It's kind of, not to get too much into Wren's territory, but their idea of the socialism that they were dealing with, or the communism, they wanted to spread that worldwide. So like their worldview and their perspectives, like you said, included everyone, even their space worldview. So I would agree with that for sure.
And I think they had a need to show that the workers' state had the ability to do things that a capitalist West couldn't or didn't have the political will to do themselves. And that they were right in a lot of ways, because our own space program didn't necessarily kick into high gear until after theirs was already well underway. I mean, even though you had figures in our country like Jack Parsons,
Sure.
and stuff who were pushing rocketry and space programs and stuff. A lot of people didn't believe it was even possible until, they get wind that the Ruskies are doing it.
Yeah, once you mentioned Parson, I find that it's interesting to me that there's this occult thread that runs through all of these initial space program guys, right?
Yeah.
So, what was his name? Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, whatever, in Russia, Wern Braun in Germany, and then Jack Parsons in America, and they're all involved in this occult kind of demonstration. And both Von Braun and Constant were into like sci-fi, but this really out there sci-fi, especially with the Cosmism, and that thread seems to kind of run through this early space program stuff.
So the next thing we can get into then with the sci-fi segue is if you guys have gotten into any Soviet sci-fi and the imaginings of aliens, and when the UFO phenomenon really started happening, and of course it happened in Russia too. And this idea I found, because I used to read a lot of these like collections of Soviet sci-fi books, and they always have our space brothers because of the Marxist dialectic. If these people are so much more advanced, then they're obviously communists already, and so they're either coming here to liberate us, or we need to get in contact with them so they can give us the technology so we can finally defeat capitalism. And we had Gullius on the show, and he talked about how there were FBI investigations into a lot of these contactee and UFO groups in America.
Right.
And it all makes sense now. I didn't really understand it at the time. It all makes sense now because there really was this current in communist thinking, and it was influencing American ufology and contactees. And even in all the sci-fi we know now, they're almost always some kind of collectivist advanced civilization, just Star Trek or whatever. And the only alternative to that is always like just monarchies, like Star Wars and stuff, where you have like, and Dune, where you have planets ruled by a monarchy. And even though they're always, or most of the time they're, they're nice kings and queens, still it's like totally, backwards right-wing politics.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you have something like Dune, like you said, that's like basically like the nightmare endpoint of like understrained space capitalism.
Yeah.
Versus something like Star Trek, where not a lot of people realize this, but Star Trek is just space communism. I mean, there's no money. Like everyone is like equal.
It's a utopia kind of concept.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's what a lot of like people, Marxists and stuff, wanted to build. I mean, that's the whole idea. Like everyone is equal. No one wants for anything. And there's have you ever read Roadside Picnic, Serfiel?
No.
Oh man, I gotta send you that. That's my favorite Soviet sci-fi book. It's the story that Tarkovsky adapted into the movie Stalker.
Stalker's great. Yeah, I love Stalker. The Zone.
Yeah. The original story is called Roadside Picnic by the brothers Strugatsky, and it's incredible. And it's a, sort of a different idea than what you're talking about, because in Strugatsky's story, the aliens are basically like unknowable entities that kind of like didn't even really make contact with us. They kind of just stopped by on Earth, left a bunch of trash, and then left. And it's all about people like, getting killed in horrible ways by the trash they left behind.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this whole idea that, like, the UFOs and the flying saucer occupants must be, by their nature, like, more advanced than us, and by being more advanced, be, communist, according to the dialectic, it's a thing that Jay Posadist talks a lot about. It kind of forms, like, the cornerstone of, like, Posadism. This idea that, like Posadist's ideas that capitalist societies are warlike by nature, right? Like capitalism requires endless war in order to sustain itself. And his thing was that since the UFOs who were visiting Earth were not invading us, they weren't trying to start a war with us, then they weren't warlike in nature, and thus must not be capitalists. So he doesn't necessarily say that they must be also socialists, but he sort of makes that conjecture. Yeah. Like either they're socialist or they have gone beyond socialism. Like, they're just, but either way, they're not capitalists.
Well, that's the thing, is that with the cosmic influence on socialism, it's like what happens after? What happens when when communism becomes cosmic, what is it supposed to do? So that it doesn't, and a lot of the thinking and some of the Posadism I'm seeing now is that, it's about emphasizing socialism's indifference to advancing beyond itself, whereas we're in a historical stage of capitalism that is just trying to hang on to what's already there and that doesn't want to move.
Yeah. Posadist makes a big point about how capitalism can't advance beyond a certain point,
right?
At least in his idea, because everything capitalism does revolves around profit, like profit and growth, but only growth in the service of profit. And so there's no incentive to just do things for the greater good of mankind, right? There's always got to be a profit motive behind it. Whereas it's not a true socialism because, like, you don't have to, everybody owns the means of production, right? You don't have to be at the behest of a corporation or a pharmaceutical company when you're developing a new drug, right? You're developing a new drug because you want to help people, not because some company's trying to make money off of it. And then that ends up leading to greater and greater progress.
And it seems like now in the West, we're kind of giving up on this, our old space exploration idea of it being ran by the state, and now we're kind of like falling into this, Tesla private exploration of space, which is the polar opposite of this cosmic communist ideation that they had.
Well, yeah, it's creeping into fascism almost.
Yeah.
I mean, you have people talking about, let's go mine asteroids, but I'm like, that's so you can make money. Or like, let's build colonies on Mars, but it's like you're wanting to build colonies on Mars so you can then exploit Mars. It's like, there's not just a pure motive exploration and advancement of our species there. There's always some sort of like motive there to gain profit.
I could see how it was empowering to them to really, thinking about a lot of these things philosophically, they would feel that they had the upper hand, at least philosophically and theoretically, as far as their mission was larger. And
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
it's pretty interesting. Well, you brought up Posadist, so can you give a background of who he was and the influence of him and how the contactee UFO material became such a part of it?
Yeah, so Jay Posadist was an Argentinian national Trotskyist who wrote several kind of papers about like UFOs and flying saucers and what it means for us and how the proletariat should engage with that material. We kind of talked a little bit about his idea that, well, since they're not capitalists, they must be, socialist or have moved beyond that or something, collectivist somehow. And he saw them as, uniquely peaceful and could offer a way for the proletariat to overthrow the bourgeoisie. He doesn't really get into specifics about that, but his basic idea, I think, is more of a psychological one. Like, we can look towards these civilizations that are coming to our planet as a model of like what we could be if we could only overthrow capitalism. And I wanted to clear up one thing, because if you look at Posadism online, you'll see like, jokes about nuclear war and like this is what Posadists actually believe. Posadist never called for nuclear war, right? He never said that we should just blow each other. Everything. He's staunchly anti-war. What he says is that like nuclear war is inevitable, like it's going to happen, regardless of whatever. And what is going to happen when it happens is that the bourgeoisie are going to destroy themselves, like, and that capitalism will fall due to global nuclear war. And that at that moment, that'll be the chance for basically the working people to rise up and take over the state. His basic idea there is that sort of the disgust that most people will feel with the states that we currently are under, after they, nearly kill everyone on the planet will be such that they'll never recover from that. Like it will spell the end of it. And that's his thing. He doesn't actually call for, okay, well, we should just have nuclear war. He's just saying that in the ashes of that nuclear war, like socialism will win. Maybe that's why we haven't had a nuclear war yet.
He sees it as inevitable.
Yeah, he does see it as inevitable. Like he's like, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And when it happens, that will be the end of capitalism. Because
does he own being a war of some kind, or does he talk about some kind of catastrophe as well? Or
I think he's specifically talking about nuclear war. I wonder if his message, if he was still alive today, if his message would be different. Maybe discussing like climate change or something like
ecological catastrophe, yeah.
Yeah, ecological catastrophe or whatever. But his basic idea is that like this system isn't going to last forever. Right, the system that we currently live under, it's going to collapse in on itself at some point when it finally exhausts itself and just falls into a heap, and that will spell the end of it. Like the proletariat will rise up and take back all these things that were taken away from them and used to basically almost exterminate them. It's like a weirdly hopeful message for the future. It's just also 6 billion people have.
Well, I mean, we're still not out of the chance of it. I mean, I don't, things seem to just be getting hotter on the world scale, and I don't, I think it's a lot, of course, with the political theory during the Cold War, you had this mutually assured destruction, and now it's kind of all these theoretical underpinnings that they had to why nuclear war didn't happen are going away. So it's like now we're back to like this balance of power kind of pre World War I thing, but there's nukes now. So I mean, the international relations haven't even figured out theories to what is probably going to happen. Who knows? And we got rogue players who can just start a whole domino effect just like they did before World War I. So,
but I don't think nukes are really no longer the object of contention here, because technology has advanced to quite a degree. So I think it's some other weapon of mass destruction other than a nuclear weapon. Yeah. If such a conflict takes place.
Yeah, it's going to be, I mean, there's all kinds of new stuff going on. I mean, there's just so many apocalyptic possibilities, yeah. Who knows?
Well, sometimes I doubt if that's ever going to happen, because I feel like capitalist powers kind of figured out after World War II that, like, hey, we can't have these big wars anymore. Like, yeah, they're great for business right after, but they're a little bit too destructive. So we're just going to have these infinitely long, smaller scale conflicts in countries that can't defend themselves instead of fighting each other.
That's hopeful.
Yeah.
Well, that's the idea of proxy war, right?
Yeah.
And all that took form after World War II. The whole concept of like American empire, this is a product of World War II. We didn't even have a standing army until after World War II. After the First World War, soldiers went back home and got with their wives. There was no standing military. That's a relatively new concept for America.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like there's been at least a kind of kitschy resurgence of Posadism that I'm seeing on the online world. Are you involved in that at all, Wren? Do you check out all the memes and stuff? Because they've turned the alt-right Pepe the Frog into this like alien reptilian dude who's trying to bring Posadism to the world, and it's pretty funny. They got a lot of good memes, and I know even at the Democratic Socialists of America convention, I think a couple years ago, I think during the Bernie Sanders campaign, they had a Posadist faction that was kind of like a joke, but they got a really good response, and everyone had a lot of fun. And have you checked out any of that stuff? What do you think about any of that?
It's funny. Like, yeah, I mean, like there is a DSA Posadist caucus, and I think a lot of it's, just ironic. Like it's kind of goofy. I mean, even Posadists themselves weren't taken very seriously. Like Cuba hated them, and
right.
I mean, but all the kind of goofiness of it aside, and sort of silly contactee stuff aside, like Posadist has some good points about war and sort of like the future that mankind. Because that's the thing about a lot of Marxists and communists and stuff that you'll talk to, they are very materialist.
Lack
They're
of
stuck
imagination.
Yeah, there's a lack of imagination. There's this sort of vague idea about revolution and about, mankind treating each other better. And, there's a lot of like very good things that come with it. But there's still sort of disconnect because of dialectical materialism from things like this. There's sort of a lack of, I don't know, like spirituality in Marxism and communism. I mean, it's interesting because there's also like a strong like sort of Catholic left that has that aspect going.
Liberation theology.
But there's not that many.
Well, then isn't the Posadism kind of, just transferring the religious idea to the aliens?
A little bit, yeah, in some way. But it's also sort of, yeah, I mean, you're right. Because in a lot of ways, like, I think like the Catholic left like looks to the teachings of like of Christ to say, that we should look after a fellow man, that, everyone should be taken care of and that sort of thing. In sort of a way, the Posadists I feel like are projecting that same sort of idea onto the flying saucer occupants.
Right.
But,
where I see it at is this concept of like assuming that extraterrestrials or aliens have to be further advanced than we are. Kind of mentioned it, but it's like what ended up happening is very much like how some interact with God. It's this appeal to a higher moral authority, right? So God's ways aren't our ways. The extraterrestrials' ways aren't our ways. It's almost like a kind of a cop-out and just replacing aliens with God.
Yeah, it's a very anthropocentric idea, I think, to think that the extraterrestrials would be like us or that they would have the same sort of values as us. I think Posadist tries to make the argument that based purely on technology, that like if they have the technology to travel to stars, then they must be more advanced than us. But I think we all know that isn't necessarily
true.
The case. And I was going to say, like,
maybe he's just kind of cynically using the zeitgeist of that time. I mean, and why not use it? I mean, sees it as a great struggle of of history. I mean, why not? They're using all kinds of stuff. Why not? Mess with UFOs instead of political violence. I mean, it's like it seems like good.
Did he claim to have contact with UFO occupants?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
I don't think that he ever actually saw a UFO or had any personal experiences with it. So in some ways, yeah, like, well, there's this line. So he wrote, if you ever want to read this, it's not a very long read, but it's just called Flying Saucers, the Process of Matter and Energy, Science, and the Revolutionary and Working Class Struggle. And
that's too much stuff thrown in all at once, man.
I read it.
Yeah,
it's pretty interesting.
And you're right, Serfiel. He kind of just uses them as an example, basically. Like,
this is a good one, though.
Yeah, like I'm gonna read like a little bit from that. He just says, when the class struggle has been eliminated in harmony as a necessity of life, thought will have a field of operation and possibilities of development infinitely superior to those that exist today. Today, thought is very limited from infancy onwards. To draw deeper conclusions on these questions, we must follow them attentively, interest ourselves with them, discuss them, learn about them, and study them. Other phenomena, like that of UFOs, will present themselves. A whole series of things will attract our attention. Is the development of matter in another universe similar to that of here? Basically, he's just saying, like, by studying the paranormal and things like UFOs, it sort of expands our ideas of what is possible, and it sort of expands the limits of our perception and understanding, and basically gets us thinking about the universe, and that is like a good thing. It's a net positive for people.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think for the left, and I'm just a pretty moderate guy, but I think there definitely needs to be more balance, because the extreme right is absolutely on fire, and they are using everything they can, and there's so much of their imaginations going into this stuff, and we are circling back to Russia, but now it's under these different guises on the other side of the political spectrum. But, you know, I think the only thing that's going to really can galvanize the left is to present futuristic ways of thinking versus this, you know, neo-traditionalist stuff that's going on. If somehow they can, you know, turn back the hands of time and we can go back to some kind of primitive Christian, you know, civilization exemplified by what Russia is trying to become. You know, I mean, it's crazy. Yeah. And I think it would do them well to try to take at least something from this history. You know, to be positive for the future, because we also can't just blindly give the future and the you know, power of technology to this kind of new, like we were talking about, weird neo-fascistic, super empowered individual corporate, you know, overlords. You know, like being the only ones who will have the benefits of this technology and the only ones to direct it. So,
you know, that's interesting because in the Cosmism, part of the was that it was supposed to be universal. So, you know, it was supposed to be for everybody. The immortality and all of the good things they talked about was meant to be shared with everyone. So I thought that was cool. Yeah,
it's a big thinking, and then I think it merged with Marxism because Marxism also had this grand plan for humanity. Now, all this was birthed, of course, in this unique civilizational space of Russia, and Russia's characterized itself, and I've heard this out of plenty of Russians themselves, that it's a more spiritual civilization that has always been open, even, you know, after modern times, after materialism came to dominate so much, but has always been open to these kind of spiritual phenomenons and psychic phenomenon in particular as a very long and deep history in the Russian civilization. And the USSR did conduct openly and secretively tons of psychic research as well,
which can also go into the Eastern Orthodoxy's emphasis on mysticism too. Yep.
Right. Yeah, I think that's, you know, the huge impetus for the spiritual nature of the Russian people is definitely the Eastern Orthodoxy, because, you know, that split between the two Christianities, the Western Church and the Eastern Church. I'm not a super theologian, but that was a pivotal moment, because essentially the West from that point went extremely materialistic, and the East went the other direction. So I think that's what's responsible for their more spiritual way of looking at things.
Yes, yeah, very much agreed. It seems to be, especially now when the Eastern Orthodox Church has become more and more visible and have more and more power over there, that emphasis is coming back.
Yeah, I mean, Putin seems to be kind of, you know, emphasizing that aspect of Russia.
Right.
So
which kind of leads me into
definitely
a question
think
I was thinking about when you guys were talking about this, is how much is this cosmism and all this whole concept influencing what's going on over there now?
I don't know if it's super influential like it used to be there, but I do know that Psi Research is still continuing there, and there could possibly be an interesting connection with Putin and Psi Research done in the past. I mean, he's a dude,
right?
And they were the ones in charge of Psi Research, especially psychotronic research during that time. So I wonder, like, how involved he was with it or what he thinks of it.
Well, from what I remember reading about Putin, I think he was like more like a case officer, you know, like actually in charge of, you know, turning agents and so forth. But he would still be privy to some of that information. But it's interesting you mentioned that in combination with space. I know in some of the experiments that they did, they actually found that the psi ability works better in space or in a zero gravity environment. So I'm sure they're coupling that with their space program today.
Wow, hey, get into that. That sounds cool.
New one on me, man. That's
Yeah, I mean, they, a big part of their experiments was the concept of distance, and is there a distance limitation to psychic ability? So they would have, two telepaths sending messages, 3,000 miles apart, or a telepath on the space station orbiting the Earth sending a message down to someone on Earth. They did a lot of these experiments. That not just telepathy, but just psi period works better in a zero gravity environment, and it also works well underwater. So you can obviously imagine they were also using this to communicate with submarines as well. So they were fully integrating psi into their military, not just as like, a side interest. Like, I think this was a fundamental root of their whole enterprise into psi.
Yeah, that's something that I think Ed May talked about, that during the Chechen conflict in the 1990s, that like there was this guy, Lieutenant General Alexei Savin, and he was basically the guy in charge of Russia's psychics, or like state psychics, and that they actually were like in combat on the front lines in Chechnya, and in contrast, kind of out of, like really far away from what they were viewing.
Right.
Savin's crew were basically on or near like the combat zones, and they would do remote viewing to do like swift tactical problems and to help them focus.
It's like the New Earth Army stuff.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Like they would actually like do interrogations on captured militants, and some of the people got public rewards for that, like Alina Kelmova. But I think that's super interesting because like you see this really different like methodology in the way the U.S. handled Psi research, especially like military psychic stuff, versus what the Russians were doing with their military psychics.
Yeah, it's interesting that there was he's not Russian. I think he's Czech. He's from Czechoslovakia, but Dr. Milan Reisel, and he actually developed a system for creating psychics. Yeah, and I guess it's like one of two, tried and true tested systems to create a psychic. Now, when I say that, I mean everyone is psychic to a degree, but to like really bring out the latent psychic powers in a person, he developed a system, and eventually it ended up getting used by the Navy SEALs through Dr. Richard Allen Miller.
Interesting. So what was the process that he was developing?
I'd have to pull out the book to find it exactly, but it would be like I think it would go for a year, and it would just be a series of hypnotic inductions. What I found is that the root of a lot of this stuff is all hypnotism and suggestology, suggestion. Mm-hmm. So he would induct them, 3 or 4 times a week, giving them, various suggestions they're all affirmations, essentially positive affirmations.
Yeah, so like
about their
if they believe
ability.
They can do it, then of course it's probably better.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say there's an interesting sort of parallel there, like both Alexei Savin in Russia and Joe McMoneagle in the U.S. Both of these guys were psychics in their own right, some of the best psychics that have probably ever lived, and they both had near-death experiences. Like, Joe McMoneagle had this experience when he was stationed in Germany in which he thinks he was poisoned or something, and he ends up having like a near-death experience, and after that basically gets unlocked. He had sort of been able to do a little bit when he was younger, but now it was just like in overdrive. And Alexei Savin was apparently pronounced clinically dead when he was 6, and then he died again when he was 7. And he had another near-death experience when he was 8. So he had 3 of them in 3 years. And then afterwards, he could felt he could read people's minds and access information and that sort of thing. And I've heard this all over the place. Board of the Rutgers on Cheryl Lee had a ton of near-death experiences.
Didn't Ingo have near-death experiences too?
What was that?
Didn't Ingo Swann have a near-death experience?
I'm actually not sure about that. I feel bad not knowing that because I know a good bit about Ingo Swann. I'm not sure if he ever had a near-death experience. It wouldn't surprise me if he did, though.
Right.
You have this idea that this experience of the near-death experience unlocks something and allows you to access this latent ESP.
Well, then that sounds like how all the mystery schools have the simulated death
Yeah, and the
of course.
Egyptian, the pyramids. I mean, those are literally immortality machines. What they do is, like, the king would go through the pyramid, and sort of it would simulate a trip to the underworld where he would die, and he would lay in the coffin and everything, and die, and then come back to life like Osiris,
Right.
and ascend the pyramid and stuff. This is like basic immortality tech that's been done ever since like the
Right. And you know what, calling it technology, I think that was definitely in their mind, like, because like you said, this is all kind of ancient underworld chthonic technology. And I think the Soviets were thinking that way when doing the Psi, because I mentioned it to you last night, Wren, like when rereading some of this research and stuff, what struck me is, what the Soviets were basically doing was, giving a scientific theory to magic, it's straight up. Because everything they were doing is basically magic. It's occult, literature is what they're doing and trying to test it in a scientific way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some of that, I wonder if that is sort of the side effect of the materialism that was present in Soviet Russia.
Right.
Like this idea. I mean, I don't necessarily think that dialectical materialism means like that there's an absence of a spirit world or whatever, or
right.
psychic abilities. I think it basically just says, hey, people's material conditions are based on like the history and stuff. But it did put forth this sort of distrust of the church. Soviet Russia was an atheist state, and things like the occult and spiritualism were very frowned upon. But then again, too, they realized that this research, they realized it was real, and that this research could be useful on some level. I think the higher ups thought, hey, we could use this.
Definitely.
And so the researchers sort of had to cloak it in the air of materialism, right? Like, let's treat this like a science and a technology. And maybe there's good things because of that, because in some ways, yeah, you could use the scientific method. People like Dean Radin today use the scientific method to explore this stuff. And maybe it has advantages, but on some level, I think you run the danger of treating it too materially. And you sort of miss some aspects of it because you're trying to – because some of the stuff I was reading about this, they tried so long to put forth this theory, like the Russian researchers did, that this was electromagnetic in nature.
Right. That was a huge topic of discussion. Well, what kind of energy is Psi phenomenon, or is it even an energy?
So
exactly.
they're kind of like resurrecting some mesmeric stuff.
Yeah. That played a heavy role.
Trying to find a physical aspect of it so that it could fit in the materialist paradigm for them.
Yeah. Try to find the psychic particle, like what is it? What's the particle of information that goes off? And they never were able to find it.
No.
And I don't think it will, because it's not it doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the closest you can get to it is stuff like Rupert Sheldrake's like kind of morphogenetic field kind of thing. That there's some sort of, possibly non-material field that is around living things that transmits information. But it's not like there's a physical particle that you can measure that is involved with that. Because on some level, it's not acting in what we experience as physical reality.
Right.
Or whatever physical conditions are able to be measured, it's only those things being impacted by a non-physical.
There was some cool Russian research I was reading. One of them was like they had two cells, and one cell was like infected with a virus, and they put the cells like between a pane of glass and a pane of quartz.
Yeah.
There was some interesting work done in that regard, like trying to figure out what the mechanism of action of Psi abilities are. And these scientists took like two different cells, like animal cells. One was infected with a virus. One was separated by a glass divider, one was separated by quartz. And I think like quartz filters ultraviolet radiation, so like ultraviolet radiation could go through the glass one. And what was interesting is in the one where ultraviolet radiation could be transmitted between the two cells, the other cell got the virus, even though shouldn't have been any way that virus could have like transferred itself.
Right.
It was almost like it mysteriously got the virus too, because it could somehow interact with the other virus. And I think Sheldrake's research, this may have been Sheldrake, may have been somebody else, but it's sort of the same idea that they had two groups of mice, one group that was like starved and another group that was given lots of food would eat more and more, and even though they had plenty of food. And their theory behind this was that somehow the starving mice were communicating with the mice that were well fed on some level, and they were, sending across famine signals, like there's not enough food, you have to eat more. And, while that may not actually be the case, I think that morphogenetic field research is very interesting, and just in our culture in general. Like, how do we influence everyone around us, like, without realizing it on some just completely invisible level? Like, do we send information to each other even when we don't realize it?
That's very interesting. And then it all makes me think that in addition to being more open to certain ideas being researched by scientists, they also probably didn't have a lot. Is there their unofficial or totally black studies that were very unethical too? Because I mean, they have to have had less ethical constraints than at least our surface scientific establishment here.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly did some studies that probably wouldn't have been done over here in America. Well, actually, they were, some of them, but well, yeah, I mean, for instance, they did a lot of work on transferring, emotion. Well, they did disease transference, kind of like what Wren was talking about. And let me add on that, actually, so that when they would set up the various glass screens or quartz, whatever, to separate the two petri dishes. But what they also put lead in between it, assuming it would block it, and it went straight through. And that they found that whatever this energy is, it actually also performs better in a Faraday cage. So, I don't think you can necessarily block it.
I mean, did they do things to people?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. So what they would do is they would also do these experiments on broadcasting different diseases or specifically emotional states. That was one where they really got in on. So they would get through an EEG, they would get the brainwave pattern of the emotional state of, say, a schizophrenic.
Oh, shit.
And then they would transfer schizophrenia through this field to another human, or any emotion for that matter.
Yeah, that seemed like that was a huge focus when I was doing this research on the Soviets compared to the U.S. Was that the Soviets were interested in psychotronics, like either the ability to transfer emotional states or to influence the thoughts of other people. Very interested in things like group hypnosis. And I've talked a lot of crap on where the road go, and is very skeptical about the whole sonic weapon thing that you've been seeing in the news. I thought it was just a lot of garbage. But then I started reading the Soviet Psi Research stuff recently, and I was like, damn, that sounds a lot like a psychotronic weapon. And Matt, you said that you'd read some stuff that sort of confirmed that, or at least supported that idea.
Yeah, I was trying to find it real quick, but there's a guy out there, he's a retired Lieutenant Colonel Tom Bearden, and he's wrote a bunch of books, one called The Excalibur Briefing, and then a really, really good one called Gravitobiology, where he goes real deep into all this stuff. But in both of those books, he outlines a theory that's exactly that Soviet embassy thing was. It was them testing out the psychotronic weapons, specifically transmitting these cancers and these disease states.
Golly, that stuff's crazy. Well, so all this is so timely now because we might have seen the biggest Russian psyop on America since who knows when, and we are back in Cold War II supposedly, and we had this great Cold War and arms race that is we're hailed as the victors, and we had more money to spend on technology, but with this dimension, it seems like they were probably ahead of us and are still ahead of us, and now that we're back into conflict, I mean, how is this stuff going to play out?
I mean, I would say they're definitely ahead of us, and it's interesting the track of development that was taken, especially in regards to the military. So us in the Western America, we focus real heavily on our guidance systems. And these were these intricate computers, right? And the Soviets specifically had experiments where their psychics were attempting to disable electronic systems to essentially disable America's guidance systems on their missiles and their planes and all that via psychic effects. Very, very low cost and economical.
Yeah, I mean, we were trying to do the same thing. I mean, I think Lynn Buchanan talks about how he originally got recruited into Girl Flame because he accidentally or blew up all the computers in like a base when he got stressed out. So but I don't know if we ever took it.
Hate it when that happens.
Hate it when that happens. I don't think we ever took it to the level that the Russians did. It's so interesting because you have these parallel lines of research that went in completely different directions.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Wren, go ahead.
I was going to say, like, in terms of, I don't know too much about, like, the Russia stuff in terms of, like, doing things to people, but I think we do know that in the U.S. there was a program trying to breed psychics or psychic abilities in children through trauma. I know this is something Whitley Strieber has talked about, that he may have been a part of it. And I've heard some other interviews with other people that believe that they were part of it too when they were kids.
The monarch ideas.
I think we had someone on this show that was a part of that still does not know it.
Yeah, that stuff is crazy. That's it's mind control. It's the trauma-based mind control. And the basics of that is when you experience trauma, your brain will create a memory wall around that trauma. So an example would be you're in war, your buddy's leg gets blown off in front of you, right? You don't want to keep reliving that over and over. So your brain will kind of wall that off. And it walls it off with essentially a memory wall. And you can implant that's how you get these multiple personalities, but you could also implant psychic abilities on this memory wall. But what they were doing in the mind control programs is they would implant altered personalities onto the memory wall. And the stronger and more intense the trauma, the stronger the memory wall would hold. And also multiple traumas would create multiple memory walls, hence multiple personalities. And so this was their goal in the mind control programs, the Monarch, like you said.
Is there anything like that came out of because we have this privilege of seeing a little more into the world, the Soviet world, because of the fall of the Soviet Union, versus our security establishment has been continuous, so we don't get to really get a glimpse. Is there anything out there with this kind of stuff that's been released?
I'm not entirely certain specific, but I can. The fall of the Soviet Union was, a boon and a half for any researcher, because so many documents got kicked loose at the fall of the Soviet Union. So many, documents in the Eastern Bloc, but then also some corresponding documents in the West had to be released because they were all released in the East. So many, many documents and classified projects came to light at the fall of the Soviet Union.
I do know that in terms of Russian attempts for recruitment, some stuff that I was reading said that they spent hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars going all over Russia to try to find people who were naturally talented, rather than like in the U.S. thing that existed. And so you couldn't really do like a recruiting thing officially. So they were, I don't know, maybe they were just trying to, look, we can't recruit them, so we're just going to make them,
So it's crazy. They're officially the atheists, but they were able to do things like that, whereas we couldn't, even though we're the religious nation. It's
well, part of that seems that they thought that there's a materialist explanation for all
another
this.
Big part
But you've got.
Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just saying that you've got this particle that's out there that explains it all. But
I was just going to say another big part, I think, is just the approach, right? So the Soviets took it for granted that these things already exist, psi ability. In the West, they were focusing all their time on trying to prove it existed. The Soviets were past that. We know it exists. Let's prove how it works, So their approach.
So what you can do after that, is bigger.
Yeah, I mean, in that respect, they're 50, 60 years ahead of the West.
Oh, yeah.
Or were then. I mean,
God.
Because
that's terrifying.
You still have people. I mean, you still have people like Dean Radin trying to convince people that it exists. I mean, I think he's moved beyond that too. He's at the point that Soviets were in the 1960s.
Yeah. Or how about Dr. William Tiller?
And I was going to mention one thing there too. Crap. lost my train of thought too.
Just the cultural manipulation and the psyop stuff that's out there. I mean, that's scary enough, and they're smart enough with that, because I feel like because, you know, you had so many people whose whole career was to influence what was then the left in America, and, you know, try to find people they could recruit, etc. But now it's like just the other side, and they are trolling and collecting and shaping the right in America. And it's probably a lot of the same guys who got rehired, you know. They're probably, I mean, and that's just that level. But now, you know, you're talking about this whole actual psychic warfare level to
well, how
this.
about this? I think it was the Waco situation, David Koresh, right? The FBI tried to bring over this Russian scientist. I don't got his name off the top of my head, but he was, I think he held the patent on this synthetic telepathy, you know, this where you can hear the voice of God technology. And they were going to try and beam the voice of God into David Koresh's head to tell him to surrender.
Oh my God!
They required this scientist to sign you know, basically saying if something goes wrong and the dude dies, you know, the FBI can't be held accountable, and he refused to sign.
Well, you know, one of the aspects you brought up, the religious aspect, and I think that's one of the things that killed a lot of and held back a lot of side research in America and ended up killing the official programs. I know McMoneagle has hinted about this. Like, my pet theory, hear it first in Conspirinormal, folks, it was the Collins elite that shut down the American Psi Research.
I like that theory. That's interesting.
And I know if you're not familiar with the Collins elite, Nick Redfern lays out a bunch of this in his book Final Events. But it's this group of like high-level officials in the like U.S. military establishment and government that formed a group basically to look at paranormal phenomena, and they quickly came to the conclusion that it was all demons, and that they were feeding on our souls, and that it was the devil, and they were trying to usher in the apocalypse. And they were high enough level to make huge decisions. I know McMoneagle has said basically like religious elements within the military are what shut down Stargate. Really? And I think if you connect the dots, you're like, it was probably the Collins elite who thought that we were getting too much into the occult and that we were going to usher in the end times and the apocalypse and stuff.
McMoneagle really said that, huh?
Yeah. I mean, he says that, it was some fundamentalists.
They were fundamentalist elements for sure. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I mean, that's my personal theory, that they were the guys who got it shut down. But you didn't have that problem in Russia, right? Because it wasn't seen as an occult thing. It was seen as a scientific phenomena. It was seen as a materialist phenomena that could be studied on a scientific level. Whereas in the U.S., you had people who saw it very much as an occult phenomena.
You know, what's interesting in the West is like, it seems like in the Soviets or in Russia, they went with like the soft approach, you know, focusing on the human's ability through their mind to produce these effects. And the West, you know, did that slightly, but what they quickly hacking into this technology via the use of technology. So they were big on, you know, transmitters and receivers and this kind of thing, not having a human as the source or as the receiver, but a machine. And you can couple this with the chemtrail and the spraying. Doing is creating an artificial medium that can transduce these signals. Now, they could be sent from a human, right? So I'm talking about amplifying telepathic or psi signals.
Which that is interesting parallels in the Russian research, because they also, at least the military elements of the Russian research, really wanted to build like, you know, a psychotron machine that could do something rather than needing a human.
They had, in short, these were talismans, you know, straight up, but they were calling them, I think they were calling like psychometric objects or psychometric machines, but basically they were objects that would store up psychic energy. You know, so almost very much like, you know, various rituals, you know, you focus in on all this energy and into this object, and then the energy itself or the object stores that energy and then can transmit it later. So they had small examples where, you know, you would charge this up with some kind of mental or psi energy, and then they would use this object to pick up all kind of other objects like it was magnetic, but these aren't magnetic objects. We're talking about, you know, wood, plastic, all of this would line up in a daisy chain on this object that was made magnetic or charged by some kind of psychic ability. So they were putting this in objects.
And then you have the weird intersection of this with the actual occult, which is something that I didn't realize until today, because I've been reading John King IV's Imperial Arts, which is like a record of his conjuration of 24 demons from the Goetia. Okay. And a lot of the abilities of these spirits, specifically spirits like Dentalian, are literally to, change the thoughts in people's heads, influence them, hypnotize people. A lot of these spirits can do things like that. And there was an interesting conversation he asked of one spirit. I can't remember what his name is, but he asked the spirit, like, could I do these things without needing you there? And the spirit was like, people use me all the time. They just don't realize it.
Right.
It seems like we're approaching this. It seems like we're approaching this merger of cybernetics and the occult in all this.
Oh, that's super interesting, because that's kind of what the Soviets were focusing on it like that, right? So it was information processing was kind of what they were focusing on as far as cybernetics go, so those two things are coupled together, I think.
Yeah. And you look at sigils, you look at the Tree of Life, I mean, they're like circuits.
Yep. Yeah.
And I'm sure some inspiration came from that stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Goetia spirit seals look like schematic diagrams.
They do.
Like microchips.
It's funny. The Soviet called this whole field psychoenergetics. So that kind of links into what we're talking about with this occult stuff.
Yeah.
And what kicked me off in that thought was you mentioned the magnetic thing. I was listening to Greg Bishop's interview last night with George Knapp and that other guy. I can't remember his name, but they did the hunt.
Jeremy Corbell.
Yeah, Jeremy Corbell. Yeah, the Hunt for the Skinwalker documentary. And one of the things that happened at the Skinwalker Ranch was they had this weird transportation of cattle or something that like magnetized the entire barn. It makes me wonder if these ESP abilities aren't somehow utilizing spirits to do them. Rather than it being like an innate human ability or even a biological phenomena, but rather something occurring on the spirit level.
I would agree with that, because I've often thought it was something going on the astral level.
Yeah, exactly. And like the way
blowing our minds, guys.
Well, like the way me and Matt go to the ritual night with Scott Stenwick, and one thing Scott has said to me before was that we all have some innate power ourselves, right? But the reason we as occultists engage with spirits is that spirits have more power than us, and we can use the spirit's power instead of using our own, right? Or we can combine our power.
Right.
So this idea that we're all kind of doing the same thing. Humans can do psychic magic themselves without any need for spiritual intervention, like I don't know, like sigil magic or something, or creating a talisman, but we can also use spirits to do similar things, and in some ways they can do things a lot better than we can. And I know that, I've heard, so this is deep woo-woo territory. We're going the deep end now. But
that's cool.
I've heard, and I don't have any sources for this, but I've heard multiple times just on various places, that not only were we researching psychic phenomena, that some elements of the government were actually researching like spirits, astral entities, like whatever you want to call them too. And like specifically, like there's hints about this in some of the books about the remote viewing project, because even though McMonagle and these guys weren't directly involved with the CIA stuff, there's these hints that the CIA was doing way spookier stuff with it, that they were actually summoning spirits and like trying to get them to kill people remotely and like do things like that, and that people might have actually died because of it. That
goes back to Jack Parsons. Were initially assigned to follow Parsons or keep tabs on him, kind of got drawn into this occult world, and there ended up being a whole section or a whole group of agents that became occultists, intelligence agencies, flat out occultists, doing just what you were talking about, Wren.
It makes me think like if like the Collins Elite thing wasn't more of a reaction to the remote viewing stuff, but more like they found out about what the CIA was really doing.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Right.
This is too much. Yeah.
Wow.
And, you know, like, I don't know, it kind of reminds me of, like, it's funny because this stuff is in pop culture, right? Like, this is Stranger Things. I mean, we're talking about the plot to Stranger Things here.
That was a great show.
Right.
Great show.
Yeah.
Right.
Like,
That's all the Montauk stuff in Stranger
very
Things.
Lovecraftian. Like, that was a great show.
Yeah, I mean, you have children being traumatized in order to awaken psychic abilities, the summoning of creatures from other dimensions,
Cthulhu.
like, and all this stuff is like, people, I think when they watched that show, didn't realize that, like, it wasn't that far off from what we were really doing. It's not even that fictional. Like, we really had people doing this stuff.
Yeah, what was her name? 11, right?
Yeah.
They really did that. Back to the mind control program, you know, at least the way the Americans approached it, it was very much based on dissociation. You know what I'm saying? You'd have to dissociate the mind, right? But they found that children, unfortunately, were the best for this because, you know, children can dissociate much easier. So, unfortunately, those were often the test subject and the more extreme tests that they were doing.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, they're and the weird thing is that they're right about that.
Yeah.
I mean, like, you know, I have a lot of out-of-body experiences, and I can feel like I can tie that directly back to abuse that I had in my childhood. And I think they realize this, that it's much easier to build these psychics than it is to wait around for someone who's just like a natural, like Ingo. You know, because people like Ingo are one in a million. You know, like, you know, everybody's a little bit psychic, but not everybody's psychic like Ingo. He's the Kobe Bryant of, you know, ESP. So it's like, you know, I think they saw themselves like with the inability to publicly admit that it was real. There's no way to do like a large scale recruiting program other than just like getting people who are already in the military, like Buchanan. So
that kind of goes back to, you know, Milton Roswell's work where he had the system to, you know, create psychics. And again, it was all based on hypnosis and suggestion, you know, so I think, and like they were doing some real interesting stuff. So he did an experiment where he would do essentially like a hypnosis reincarnation. So he had his group of test subjects and he would induct them and then start giving them suggestions that they were famous painters. And now, mind you, these test subjects come from a zero art background, right? Can't draw a stick figure. I think this was a study that ran for 3 months. They would have multiple induction sessions where they would be told that they are a Rembrandt or a Poussin or whoever. You can paint like him. Your strokes are just like him, so on and so forth. And by the end of this period, these people are painting, you know, like they're pros for sure, but damn near as good as who they were supposed to be. But they also started to take on characteristics that were known and some that were unknown about these people. They started to really start being these other people through this hypnotic suggestion. They became new people, essentially.
You know, it's interesting. You talk about becoming new people. One of the things I thought was interesting that Russell Targ pointed out was that, you know, all of these guys, and most of them were military, that they recruited to become remote viewers for the military. They ended up all becoming anti-war. Like something about engaging with these powers offered some kind of insight into their own spiritual nature and like, you know, like consciousness and everything. And it made them all, you know, become like hippies, basically. Like they all became anti-war, empire. And that's what the Russians found too. Like I remember, I'm trying to find the quote here, but one of the Russian recruiters, they would recruit these young kids from like working class families who had like rough childhoods, who were maybe involved in crime, drugs, and that sort of thing. And they would take those guys in order to like turn them into psychics. And in a lot of ways, it completely changed their lives. Like it made them like new people. Because they were exposed to this thing that was bigger than them. And it opened up their minds in such a way that it was like a net positive for their personalities.
And exposed them to something that was bigger than the state. Right.
You know, there was the other side to that coin slightly. Some of the psychics in the Soviet Union seemed to be particular older women, but who were psychic in wonder read people's futures. And this was nutty. Like they could, I don't know if it was by touch or whatever it was, but they could see a kid a child and like predict their life, who they're going to marry, how many kids they're going to have, when they're going to die, so on. And they all were in the same village relatively, so they could check these out 15 years down the line. And she was always accurate, but she was always extremely depressed and very melancholic. Now, this could just be because she's foreseeing everybody's death, but it just seemed like almost a general sense of foreboding from her steady tapping into this, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if it always leads towards love and light. You know what I'm saying? It could go the other way.
Yeah.
Yeah. I got a question. When is there anything that has been released since that maybe we didn't know about, as far as when the Soviets occupied so much of that, what was a German sphere? Did they get any weird information about this the psychic war that the Third Reich was doing at the same time? I mean, and I know we incorporated so much of those people into our intelligence establishment. I'm wondering if the Soviets have any information that maybe, you know, we wouldn't put out publicly that came out after the Cold War about things that they found in the German occupied areas having to do with this kind of phenomenon.
I'm not really aware of any specific psychic experiments that, you know, the Nazis may have been working on that got transferred to the Soviets. You know, obviously they got a lot of the technology like we did. But I'm not aware of any direct psychic experiments. What about you, Wren?
Not really either, other than just like, you know, the typical like Nazi Bell stuff and the stuff that may be going on in Antarctica. Like, I'm not really sure that it's weird, because that was one of the reasons, or at least our justification for grabbing so many Nazis and pulling them over here, was that if the Russians got a hold of them, they would just hang them. So,
right.
Like, but you know,
and if we had this psychic war going on during the Cold War, I mean, you got to think, you know, they must have felt really engaged, but the Russians did, because they knew how many Nazis were working with us too, you know. So it's like this continued conflict with the same people, fighting each other.
There was sort of a sort of connection there. Like, apparently, Sergei Vronsky, like he was a psychic, and he apparently visited Berlin a lot and studied hypnosis, clairvoyance, astrology, and stuff. And he was actually in close cahoots with top German leadership. He was apparently Rudolf Hess's like personal astrologer. He knew Erwin Rommel, and he was a physician to Hitler.
Did they actually kill him?
No, he was actually a double agent. So, like, even though he was exposed to this stuff, but I don't know. In some ways, I wonder if he exposed the Germans to this kind of stuff.
Well, I don't know about that, because, you know, the Germans have a heavy occult background. But there was another psychic that was hanging around Hitler and some of the high-level Nazis as well. But they ended up killing him. I sent him to a camp or something, because he was able to tell them about some of their classified projects that he, you know, got the information through psychic means. And, you know, at some point that scared them. And so they killed him. But you know, the Third Reich definitely had its own esoteric and occult background, you know, with the Tula Society and all their secret societies that kind of midwife the Nazis into action. So, and then you also have, I don't lend too much credence to this story, but you have the channeling story with Maria Orsic and the other medium who supposedly channeled these aliens from Aldebaran to build the UFO and all this nonsense, right? But it does involve channeling, so there is that story, but I don't lend a lot of credence to that one.
Right.
Well, that's the thing I didn't bring up earlier about the Jack Parsons thing. If you look at this from the aspect that the spirit world is a reality, I wonder how much of these projects and the push to do certain things are influenced by spirits themselves. Like, we know that, like, okay, so basically the father of modern rocketry is Jack Parsons, and he was Thelemite, and he was trying to summon Babylon. I've heard people say before that basically, you know, John Dee built the British Empire on the advice of spirits, and that for some reason these at least one faction of spirits want to push for some reason. And it's interesting because you look at some of the German stuff, and I'm trying to remember the guy's name now, but he believed that he was channeling the spirit of some like Teutonic king
I think
that
that's,
existed in Germany.
Rudolf von Bettendorf.
Yeah, like one of those guys, and he sort of saw like the spirits were basically telling him, to conquer the world for Germany, and then you have a lot of people who were involved in like the Bell Corporation and stuff like that who had sessions, and I wonder just how much of this stuff gets influenced by people getting in contact with spirits.
I would think a lot. When you just mentioned that challenge session, Peter Levenda talks about a group called the Nine.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah, the Nine.
Yep.
So I would venture to say that's probably the case. A lot of folks also were saying that Hitler had some entity that he was talking to, or he may have been. Well, everybody said he was possessed, but there is a story about him talking to some kind of entity, a demon or an alien or whatever that was kind of directing him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think he called it the future man or something like that.
Yeah, and he was talking about he was super scared of it or afraid of it.
Yeah. There's a lot of that kind of stuff towards the end of his life.
He was also just methed out like
Yeah.
crazy.
He was methed out like crazy.
Yeah.
But when you they had a whole branch of the government devoted to this, right? The SS Ahnenerbe, the Ancestral Research Division. I would love to get a hold of original documents, but I've got a couple books where they talk about it, and basically their job was to go out all over the world and try to find traces of Atlantis, the German Atlantis, but what they focused heavily on was the technology, and the spirit technology. So they would record a lot of spirit folk tales and incantations and all of this stuff, like record it on tape or video and bring it all back to Germany and study and find out how we can apply this to our weird theory we got going on here.
Yeah, that's why I was wondering if the Soviets, got any of that stuff, and that would be the only way a lot of that stuff would, come out. But
I think the bulk of that Ahnenerbe research, some of it went to the West, but I think just like the Bell, I think all the good stuff, went to Argentina with Bormann.
Yeah, that would make sense if they really valued it like that. Yeah. Because they definitely, plenty of them had ample opportunity to get out and take whatever they wanted with them. And then you have the U-boats and everything. So
without a doubt. I mean, this was a concerted effort that was after Stalingrad. Once they realized they wasn't going to win this war, they started a whole evacuation plan in 1943. So they dictated the terms of what, basically America got all the high level scientists, von Braun, Kurt Davis, Arthur Rudolph, all these guys. The Soviets got all the middle managers, but these middle managers could recreate the project. So it was kind of a very even split of the spoils that got divided. And this, I feel, was on purpose to set up the Cold War. That's always been a German political position: play the East against the West.
Play the East against the West. Yeah,
they would call it the third way or the third position.
Yeah, but how much of the East versus West thing was even just an illusion? Because I've heard, kind of whispers that, there was a tacit agreement between United States and Russia that they would put up the facade of being enemies, but they were basically like, okay, well, you guys control that part of the world, and we'll control this part of the world, and we'll pretend like we hate each other, but we're really not going to get into a war.
I think that.
Well, that's what that flyer said, right, Wren?
Yeah.
That flyer that I read.
Oh yeah.
Richard Hoagland also kind of says something like this, where when he talks about the various launches that went on during the space race for satellites and whatnot, when he had a layout table of the launch dates, and it looked like nothing but coordination, right? America will launch a satellite or two, then Russia will go with one or two, then America. Like, it was so coordinated that this could not be two separate programs launching independent of each other. Like, there was some kind of collusion there.
Very interesting. I didn't know we were going to get so much into the mind control stuff, too. That was cool, because that's one of my favorite subjects as well.
This conversation just veered in many different ways, which I'm happy about. Guys, any final thoughts on this before we go?
This was great.
Awesome. Wren?
Yeah, don't let Geddy Lee get you.
Yeah, that's true. Or Neil Peart or Alex Lifeson, either one.
Yeah, they're the masters of mind control technology.
Well, Serfiel, is there anything that you wanted to conclude this section?
I'm totally satisfied. I think this was a great discussion, and I like where it went. And it all kind of ties in and relates to itself, and it's all very timely right now, and the implications for it is very, very large.
Matt, if people have any questions or want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
They can send me an email.
Picking up.
It's ramses.le.ottimo@gmail.com.
Cool.
Yeah, we've got the psychotronic weapons coming in, even on the Skype tonight. So, and Wren, where can everybody get in touch with you if they want to yell at us for having the communist on again?
Feel free to visit my blog at liminalroom.com. Send me an email. I'm on Twitter at Mr_Apol. And you can also find me on shows like Where Did the Road Go?
Yep. All right, guys.
Cool. Thanks a lot, guys.
Very good. Stay on the line for us. We're going to close this section out. And, guys, we'll be back to close the show on Conspirinormal. We're back. So I just kind of sat back on this one because I really didn't know a lot about the subject.
Thanks, man. It was great.
And so I just wanted to get your thoughts on it. Like, what did it meet your expectations as far as what we talked about?
Yeah, we talked about everything I want to talk about. It's just it's such a it's so unique. There's so many paradoxes in it. It's a study of Russian civilization and ideology and history, and these big spiritual questions, and then we really got into the mind control stuff after that, and so it was excellent.
Yeah, we veered into the territory of American mind control and the Psi Research, which I think it kind of all goes hand in hand.
Yeah, because the Cold War was an aspect to the Cold War. We were basically in a psychic war. Who knows what was actually going on? Who knows what's going on now? Because it's probably the same people.
Yeah, so what I was talking about, and people can go back and listen to this when I said that we had somebody on that I think was involved with this, because they were talking about the psychic, the experimentation on children.
Monarch, yeah.
And Alta Dillard, when we had her on, Chad and Alter, this is before you came around, but you might have heard that show, and that was mostly about her kind of like psychic experiences, high strangeness, and possible UFO abduction experience in the French Quarter. Really interesting.
Oh, I remember that.
And she, in the very beginning, she talked about going to somewhere in
some weird
Colorado.
institute, some weird place for children where there is almost like Akira or something.
Yeah, and they were doing psychic testing on her, and that's all she remembers. And I spent probably like 10 minutes talking to her about that, because I was like, wait a minute, because I had heard of that kind of stuff that it happened.
And have you seen Akira?
No.
Oh, dude, it's like the biggest anime of all time, but it's about this weird psychic experiments on children, and this kind of, I guess, transhumanist trying to find the next step in evolution, and it going wrong and getting out of control, and basically this kid becoming doing the same thing that happened before. They had the experiments before, and like it created a huge catastrophe, and then this kid nowadays is turning into it's basically like almost a Christ type of mind or spirit and matter merging into this next step of evolution, but it's just causing total chaos and destruction on this planet. But yeah, that's what that was all about. So I was really into that as a kid, and then I found out about all this like Monarch stuff and Montauk and all this stuff that centers around children and psychic abilities. So it definitely hit a root,
No, I've heard of Akira, but I've never actually.
Oh, dude,
I've never actually seen it.
Gotta see it.
So it sounds like I need to see that. It sounds like it's right up.
It's the best
right
anime
up my
of all
alley.
time, man.
But yeah, that's so. I was interested in that, and it's interesting that here's somebody that I think possibly was a part of this, and now has had these kind of strange experiences for a good deal of her life. So,
because she wasn't even like. It was really vague to her. That's what I remember from listening to it.
Yeah, she didn't remember a lot of it.
And it wasn't something that was like totally integral to the whole story or something that she was really trying to like play on or anything. It was like, it seemed
she
really
just
honest.
mentions it in passing. Yeah, I mean that was the thing about that interview was that first of all I really enjoyed it, and second of all I really feel like they're telling the truth as they understand it.
What that all makes me think about too is that in like we talked about all the we've been talking about all the mythos going on in the conspiracy world and like all this pedophilia stuff and all this other stuff, and like maybe there's a lot deeper things to it than this like surface level pedophilia shit.
Yeah, I was gonna mention, but I wanted to keep the guys talking. Was about the Finders case.
Yeah,
that when the police asked the two men that had these dirty, unkempt children that they had keeping in the back of their van, where they were taking the children, they said they were taking them to some special school somewhere. I think in Mexico. So, what is that?
Weird.
Yeah. And they had all these kind of weird CIA connections too. There's been a couple of authors that have written about it. McGowan actually writes about that. I think we mentioned that briefly when we talked about Program to Kill. So there is that. I watched a documentary that just came out called Active Measures.
Yes, you told me.
About Trump and his relationship to Russia and Putin.
Which you've been very skeptical. I've seen your evolution with this stuff.
Yeah.
Because you've been very skeptical, and it's good to be skeptical about especially big narratives that are pushed by mainstream media. But I've seen your evolution in this, and I feel like you've kind of come around to like saying that there's really something to this stuff. I jumped the gun really early.
I want you to see it.
Yeah, I'll check it out.
We'll talk about it.
We'll talk about it on the next episode.
Right.
But I jumped the gun really early because of I'm kind of a Russophile, and I've studied a lot about Russia, and I've paid attention to how they've been trolling the right wing for so long now, and so I jumped the gun early, and I was like basically throwing it in a lot of my right-wing friends' faces and like, oh man, you guys are getting played so bad, blah blah, during the early stages of the election when Trump was becoming a serious candidate.
Yeah.
And but yeah, I definitely want to check it out. It sounds interesting.
I do still think, as far as the WikiLeaks stuff, that there could have been some people in the DNC that were disgruntled Bernie Sanders supporters that did leak some of that.
Oh, absolutely.
I still think that's entirely possible and entirely plausible. Whether it was Seth Rich or not, I don't know. I do find the whole Seth Rich thing really weird and really suspicious. But given how the Russians are also known to kill people in very mysterious ways, who knows actually who could have done that. But like I said, I want you to see it, and I'd like if Rob can be with us next week. I'd like him to watch it too.
He's gonna
just to
see
get
it because he's laying down being sick, so he can definitely watch it.
That'll be a good one. It is on Hulu, and it's kind of gotten a lot of press, especially in the left wing.
Who made it?
I don't know the name of the director. He had gone on Bill Maher. And
Oh, wow,
Maher
it's like that?
Bill Maher had been really pushing it, and so it finally came out, and I watched it. Like I said, I don't want to go much further into
Yeah,
it.
we'll
'cause
talk
I want
about it,
you
but
to see it.
But it's relevant to what we were talking about
Yeah.
today, and that's
Yeah.
what I mean. All this is so timely, and it's like if the people in the former Soviet Union, mostly Russians, were on that kind of level, like we explored with the mind control stuff tonight, then, I mean, what's going on now? And now that what's going on here is going on.
There's also a part of this too that there's a surrealist. There is a very surrealist atmosphere to some of the stuff that the Russians do.
Yeah,
and it's almost as if they are creating this online, and by extension, real reality. Like they have just really become masters at perception management.
yeah. Well, we're talking about people who were employed by a authoritarian regime, and they got their jobs back. You know, Russia did a great job of reintegrating the private sector under total control of the state. You know, it is a capitalist country, you know, per se, but they know who's boss. It's different. It's this hybrid authoritarian capitalist thing, but all these people who learned all these skills and all these people whose main job was to manipulate us, I mean, it's in high demand again, and so I'm sure they're right back at their jobs. It's just they've got a different target
and newer jobs and newer concepts that were around when that were not around when the Soviet Union fell. I will say this as far as my evolution about this is I see the Russians as trying to sow discord more than it was to try to get Trump elected.
That makes a lot of sense.
That may have been a side effect.
I don't necessarily
and a very
think
opportune side effect for them, but I still think that people voted for Trump because they really believed in what he could do for them.
Of course.
And they also that there's the perception that really needed no prompting from the Russians that Hillary Clinton was pretty corrupt.
Yeah.
And a political opportunist herself.
Absolutely.
I've never particularly liked her myself, which is why I couldn't bring myself to vote for her.
Right.
But I really couldn't bring myself to vote for Trump either.
Yeah.
But I'm just one of those people that caused all this problem.
Oh, that's what they say. We got to just keep playing the game.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
Like I said, let's talk about it more next time.
Cool.
And get your insights into it as well, and hopefully Rob. And shout out to Rob, man.
Shout out to Rob.
Yeah, he's just having a hard time. So I want everybody to put your positive vibes and your energy, your thoughts and your prayers. Put those out to Rob over the next week. That he is
aim your good psychotronic weapons
exactly
towards Hermitage.
Exactly. That
Tennessee.
that he will feel less stressed and more able to do things and be a part of what's going on. We miss him, So, all right. Well, I think that's it, man. I think we'll call it there. Next time, we have Mark Stavish. We're going to talk about a concept that I just recently heard of because I just recently heard of him, called egregores, which are a kind of tulpa. And I think that this one will be pretty interesting. And it's It's like, I think this book that I'm going to read about is only like 120 pages.
Cool.
So,
knock it out. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, guys, Patreon, we don't have any new episodes up, but we have a lot of them up. So if you're interested in throwing some money our way and getting something in return, go to www.patreon.com/Conspirinormal. And also, if you just want to leave the one-time donation, www.conspirinormal.com, which I don't do that as well as Rob. That's why we need him, among other things.
We're going to do a Conspirinormal telethon soon, so you guys look out.
Yeah, we need to talk about that. Yeah, we do need to talk about that. And hopefully we're going to be appearing on some other podcasts soon, but we'll talk about that as well. So, all right, guys, thanks so much, and I hope you enjoyed our little special about space communism, our cosmism, our Soviet psychic manipulation.
Cosmic communism.
Cosmic communism on Conspirinormal.